Kicking off this session here, we have Duncan Watkins, Principal Consultant at Forrester Research. And Duncan joins us, and he's using the crystal ball, I believe, the Forrester crystal ball, and he's asking the question, ITSM and the cloud, where next? Duncan, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark and Mark. Really appreciate that. And as Mark suggested earlier today, I'm not looking that far into the future. So perhaps a crystal ball isn't needed. So in Q2 last year, we undertook a large survey of technology professionals. We surveyed 268 digital IT people, and to better understand the current state of technology operations, and with particular regard to things like cloud. And really, we found three main things. The first was there are a number of new ways of working appearing in organizations, so things like agile, DevOps, product management. And these have caused significant shifts, but there's not one clear blueprint for managing services that's emerged yet. So it's still a bit of a murky world with lots of different things going on. The second thing we found was that many traditional ITSM disciplines do still have relevancy, but they've been maybe adapted or changed to take account for things like cloud and new technologies. And lastly, we saw that there was a huge effect that automation was having on the way you manage services. And I know, both Richard and Mark have talked about that earlier this morning, and I'll elaborate a bit more on what we mean by that and what the impact is. So first of all then, if we have a little look at the sort of recent history and look at some of the old ways of working that we've seen. So the old ways that we've been using for many years really on a bit of crisis, but this new digital world is still forming. It's really a time of transition for lots of technology organizations worldwide. But these old guard practices are really losing their relevancy. Governance over sort of plan, build, run life cycles isn't quite suitable anymore. But whilst this new world is forming, there's many questions remaining about what an integrated digital first technology operating model really looks like. So we've heard increasing reports of there being organizational conflict as this happens. There's generational divides partly in this, and there's disagreements over which parts to retain and which parts to evolve. So in this current flux, let's have a look at what old ways of working really aren't cutting it anymore. So which things have really gone the way of the dinosaur? What is dying out? Well, first of all, the idea of like a very hierarchical organization based upon specialty, including the IT department, really is starting to recede. The days when you had Unix engineers and QA specialists sat in separate groups with well-established monopolies over the domain really are getting numbered. Cross-functional product teams are much more the order of the day now, where you share experiences across the board. The logical endgame of this, obviously, is the elimination of a traditional IT organization. But I have to be very clear here, we're not seeing a phase out of IT, more the idea that everyone will work in IT in some way or other. The strict segregation of development operations is starting to break down, but perhaps more slowly than some people have predicted. The idea for DevOps now is very much an idea of you build it, you own it. So this means that ongoing evolution of products coexists with their operational delivery. Project management is starting to recede. So McKinsey's Global said that the project management is a fading archetype. Now, the market for project managers in the workforce is still fairly healthy. And certainly there's a strong need for traditional project management in fields such as heavy industry and finance. But we're observing a growing disinterest from digital and IT first organizations in project management offices in particular. Clients are increasingly moving to things like Kanban and Scrum and SAFe across the board. We're also seeing a death, or not really a death, but a lessening of process management. So for many decades, Lean Six Sigma and related approaches represented the orthodoxy, justified through the success of kind of Taylorism in the 20th century. However, with this breakdown in the operations and development sides, the variable nature of modern products is meaning that process-based management is really falling by the wayside as a principal idea. One example we saw was of Starling Bank considers it an organizational failure when it hears the phrase, I can't do this because I'm waiting for this person or that department. So things are becoming much more modular, much more agile in the way things work, and perhaps strict processes are not the order of the day. And also the idea of governance that is based on stage gates is starting to die out. So the project life cycle of plan, build, run has very much found its way into IT governance over many years. But that sort of a life cycle handover from development to operations often called for things like security views or change approval boards. But now what we're seeing is semi-autonomous product teams optimizing their life cycles for both speed and agility. And any delay in that is now being seen as unacceptable. One of our clients, CSG, a major payments processor, recently noticed it's actually abolished its change advisory board. And I'll talk about CABs a bit later, because what's happening with them is really quite interesting and chimes very much with what Richard and Mark said earlier. So that's the stuff that we're really seeing dying out. What are we seeing sort of coming to the fore? So one of the ideas is this rise of the knowledge worker. So the term knowledge worker was first coined by Peter Drucker back in 1959. But he defined knowledge workers as high-level workers who apply theoretical and analytical knowledge acquired through training to develop products and services. However, it's taken a long time for this thinking to overtake the kind of Taylorist ideas of machine work and really its influence on how we measure tasks. Most, if not all, roles technology are involved in really are knowledge worker roles nowadays, because we think for a living rather than performing physical tasks. So really, what is knowledge work? Well, first of all, it has an area of factual and theoretical thinking. So knowledge workers will undergo several years of training to master, to master the information they need to perform their roles. An example might be a sales manager. They must understand the knowledge of their customers' preferences and factual information about the products they sell, in order to tie those two up to be a good salesperson. That takes a long time to learn that. They also think about your own roles. You will have been through continuous learning journey as you've moved through your career, through both a mixture of formal and informal methods. So it's very much a different way of working. The second aspect is the accessing and applying information. So knowledge workers have to identify the information from pretty much, we could call it a large database of info they need to be familiar with. You've got to be in a position to be able to weed out important, there's less information, and focus on the essential pieces to help you solve problems, to help you answer questions, and to help you generate ideas. Knowledge workers will use analytical reasoning and relevant judgment to address customer issues and new situations. And really the third aspect of this knowledge work is the ability to have good, strong communication skills. There will be frequent interactions between your fellow workers, your customers, your stakeholders. You must be able to hold discussions with those workmates and to maybe deliver presentations when you need to. Modern organizations really emphasize the importance of quality customer service and continuous product improvements. And really those knowledge worker skills of being able to communicate are a central part of that. So if we've seen this rise, death of some old ways and rise of this knowledge worker piece, what is actually happening in IT organizations today? So we found a number of things. First of all, there's a real embrace of this idea of product teams. Many of our clients who use product team thinking, you might call it a Spotify model, you might call it the you build it, you run it model. But really what these organizations are doing is exercising control over the distributed infrastructure and operations staff, putting them into cross-functional teams and pursuing really a full build run model where every team is responsible for production support as well as developing things. Now that's a big change in mindset, it's a big change in the way we're doing things. What some organizations do is establish platform teams to run lower level infrastructure, but they still do it with a product mindset. Thinking beyond that product team unit is important as well. You have to understand how they relate. Obviously, some overall vision or strategy is still necessary. And obviously, organizations will document it, sometimes as a product charter, to really at the start of these product teams. The organisation should really establish things like site reliability engineering concepts, such as a service-led object as part of those charters, and really consider the overall organisational architecture. And what we find is leading organisations have started to move towards flatter organisational structures such as holacracy. Now, a lot of them aren't quite there yet, but really this idea, this sort of democratisation of power, is something that's becoming more and more prevalent. And lastly, you need to recognise that coordination is still very necessary across these teams. So next generation organisations are moving away from processes and projects, but they shouldn't assume that coordination is no longer necessary. Teams in large organisations are never fully autonomous, they're semi-autonomous. They still participate in overall organisational objectives, and they must remain aligned with other teams. One of our clients, HashiCorp, notes that their firm maintains 3 overall themes to keep this coordination together, and the capabilities they must support are value, usability, and feasibility. We've also seen some Scrum-orientated organisations using a Scrum of Scrums periodically to keep this coordination together. So although we've seen product teams forming and a lot more power being pushed down, there still needs to be some sort of coordination at a higher level. We've also found that there's a continued nurture and shared services in this survey. So enterprise service management vendors continue to drive the market for a generalized shared service portal. So the same catalog and workflow that support employees in getting new laptops, reporting IT issues, can also support HR, can also support legal, facilities, and many other services across the organization. So this frictionless access to services is essential for fast-moving digital product teams in their continuous delivery of evolving digital value. So that is becoming more and more prevalent as well. We're starting to see certainly organizations investigate site reliability engineering, if not taking it on board whole hog. So this originated in Google is becoming a key set of practices for modern digital operations. It emphasizes things like automation, reducing repetitive operational work, and running key platforms as continuous delivery pipelines. And in many cases, what it does is it fosters this build and run operating model all in go. T-Mobile, for example, reports that this SRA team has learned to deliver platforms as products, but they make themselves available across the organization really as consultants who can advise and help other teams. And lastly, we're starting to see a consideration of a thing called resiliency engineering. Now, this isn't the same as site reliability engineering. It's an emerging discipline that isn't fully formed yet, but it's got origins in cognitive psychology, human factors, ergonomics, and things like this. And central to it is a recognition that complex systems present tremendous challenges to humans responsible for operating them. In some cases, architectures become too complex for us to have effective mental models. And we also see it being borne out in the idea of the automation paradox. Now, this is the fact that if you automate many of your easy tasks, what it means is as much as you benefit from that, the remaining tasks for human operators become much more difficult to deal with and manage. So you have this paradox where actually the increase of automation makes individuals' jobs actually more harder because they're dealing with more complex problems. The last couple of things we found are related to each other. So we found that measuring value streams but not functional areas is becoming more important. So at Forrester, we received many inquiries along the lines of what are best practices for measuring change or availability or capacity or service tests? While measuring those things is important, too much focus on those lower level metrics can obscure the higher level business metrics such as customer satisfaction, net profit, and overall time to delivery. Value stream management can help you focus on those right measurements and not get too bogged down in the weeds. And also understanding how governance is starting to change to a principle and promise-based model. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's clear from our research that many companies have had positive results from DevOps and agile, for example, proof of concepts. But the entrenched governance they have and policy frameworks often stall their implementation, and certainly make it harder to scale those. We're not saying governance needs to go away, but it should shift towards a greater automation and be based upon principles. So you no longer continue to check that teams and individuals have followed procedures, but rather they've kept to their commitments. An example of this is at Sterling Bank. So they pursue a principle-based approach that achieves coherence and coordination in some key areas, things like cybersecurity, in architecture and coding. So there's governance there where it is needed, but it's really they work out where and when they need it and how they need to do it. So that's some of the first findings that we got from that survey, some of the things that died and some of the new things that are coming on board. So I'll be interested in the breakout to see how many of you are starting to embrace some of those things. But if we move on now to the findings on service management. So service management scope is actually, we found, expanding, and things like enterprise service management and automation are really defining the services of the future. What modern service management is doing is it's bringing more disciplines into the fold and rapidly automating day-to-day functions through tools like chatbots. So we'll talk through now what has changed and what still remains, and think through some of the ITSM processes that you'll be familiar with today. So if we think of a very traditional approach, and I've used ITIL 2 as a model here, but you can think of other ones as well. We think of the processes in this time were designed to improve the efficiency of delivering and supporting services. At this time, it was really good stuff, because what was happening was it brought out frustrations with the quality of services that were being delivered, and it undoubtedly improved those. However, the world's moved on dramatically since this model was first adopted. So which of these things are still relevant, or can we consign all of them to the bin? So this is the bit I talked about where people in my breakout can kind of go to sleep for a bit, but change management is still relevant. And I want to talk really about why it's still relevant. So change management may have changed, but it's important to remember that the things that it was originally needed for are still present today. So we still need some form of record maintenance. So change management really emerged to track the interactions of individuals with these complex technical systems, when managers were observing that outages usually correlated with someone changing something. That remains a key requirement, but we're seeing new methods, and we're overtaking sort of classical approaches. So for example, things like agile and DevOps practices can start to meet this objective with things like source and package management. When you then link that with automated continuous integration and release automation, you can do this in a much more streamlined way. But you still recall what's happening, you still need change management. Change management's skill for communication and coordination is still needed. So as change management is a cross-functional process, change management really spans boundaries and is suited for multiple teams. So an example might be, how can you be sure that the WANS team's plans to bring down a key circuit don't conflict with a data team's intention to move terabytes over that network as part of a data center consolidation? So organizations still need to communicate and manage the risks of these collisions, especially when those teams are maybe geographically distant or organizationally distant. So that's still a key aspect that we need to manage. And lastly, change management is very good at managing and reducing risk. At its most simplest, change management puts lots of eyes on a particular topic. It helps to build common ground, and it broadens awareness of situations that might affect multiple teams. As a whole, it provides a window into enterprise performance and risk, and it uses metrics like change failure rates, out-of-process change detection, and clusters colliding change to really help reduce that risk. And I'll talk about how that can be used a bit later. But so the fundamental reasons for bringing about change management are still there. So let's look at how change management is starting to change. Now, in bad change management, you have this idea of a vicious cycle of change. And what we want to do is really move on to the right-hand side and get this virtuous cycle of change. So what's happening on the left-hand side here? Well, what many organizations do is they misapply very big, heavy change management practices to low risk changes. So ITIL always encouraged the use of standard pre-approved changes, but many organizations believe that those low risk changes still need approval. Some of our recent data indicates that 30% of organizations with a change process still require all changes to go through the CAB. Some of the other things that organizations do are things like, keeping weekly or bi-weekly change management, which is a cadence that for modern organizations is far too slow. And a simple way to set up a CAB was to lock it to a consistent day and time, very often weekly. However, that traditional delay of waiting a week before it meets, before you can make a change, is increasingly outmoded in a world where you demand fast product feedback and fast changes. So that we're seeing that on that vicious circle side. Also, where change reviews are inappropriately technical, that can keep you in a vicious cycle of change. The purpose of a change review, when it's required, is to validate the change is ready for production and it's got all its prerequisites complete. We found that the multiple clients have reported that technical personnel on a CAB hijack the change management process to debate implementation and architecture choices rather than just check the change is valid. This kind of goes back to this idea of it's a change advisory board, it's not a change approval board. And lastly, on that vicious cycle change, often organizations can confuse change management with demand management. So what do I mean by that? So one company we spoke to had a data administration team that insisted on long lead times for its change tickets. When the company investigated some of the complaints about this, it turned out the team were using the change request process to govern and control its intake of work and ensure a generous buffer with each request. Demand management is a different thing to change management and should be managed separately. And when that happens, you can really get into this vicious cycle of change. So if we've seen what that old vicious cycle can do, what is included on that virtuous cycle of change? Well, firstly, you want to try and keep your change process lean and focus on its intended outcome of reducing risk. There'll always be changes that make an organization lose sleep. So start from the top down and identify really risky situations. Focus on difficult to reverse changes, changes that have a really broad impact, changes that have a challenging trade-off, or changes involving systems with a history of instability. You really do need to look at and monitor those sorts of changes, but the rest really you can look at in terms of standard and pre-approved changes. Really question your CAB. We're increasingly hearing accounts of organizations reducing or eliminating the change advisory board, but still maintaining a change process. One major business process outsourcing firm sunsetted its CAB, but kept a change coordination agenda item on its weekly Scrums meeting. Just because you probably might still need a CAB, you don't necessarily need to call it that. As I mentioned, separating changes from work orders is important. The intake of work is reasonable for any team, but the change process is a wrong way to handle it. Use change in ways that encourage change process avoidance. So using changes in that way can heighten organizational risk rather than reduce it, and conceal the issue of too much work in process, which is a key concern for modern organizations. Use things like modern analytics. So automated technology pipelines have rich data, which you're really begging for analysis. Things like CDRA vendors are innovating here into things called like release readiness. Enterprise service management vendors are increasingly applying advanced machine learning to change risk assessments, and we may also hear some of that later. And ultimately, we think we'll have a convergence of these CDRA release readiness tools and an ESM change management. And lastly, track and right change metrics. So change failure rate has often been a popular metric, with some organizations seeking zero failures. But targets like this can lead you back into that vicious cycle of change. Use balancing metrics, so things like measuring the percentage of changes that can be handled and pre-approved, and that will make your view of change much more broad and enlightened. Okay, so what other aspects of ITSM are still relevant? Well, we think you still need a service desk. We talked to a client of ours who were a modern cloud-native organization, and they tried to do away with their service desk, but it didn't end well. What happened were customer impacting problems were arising, but the organization couldn't easily locate which given product team was responsible, and sort of finger pointing started ensuing. So the capabilities of a service desk really provide a critical overall organizational health status and also time-sensitive advocacy for overall results. And really, we don't recommend you eliminate those. What you do need to do with your service desk, though, is move from a process-centric approach to an employee-centric one. So your company's employees must be able to get their work done anywhere and without interruption, and that must be the primary prism with which your service desk looks at things. Their employees need to be flexible in how they consume and leverage technology. So build on ITSM's customer-centric strengths and downplay the process focus, which help you to expand your service portfolio to the rest of the organization. What else really do you need to keep in choice? Well, incident management, again, is something that's not going to go away. A robust incident management process really ensures your resilience. It's a universally accepted practice. It dates from the earliest days of computing. But someone does not need to own the incident management as a service. An increasing number of organizations are embracing things like SRE that I mentioned earlier, or other practices such as swarming or blameless retrospectives. Now, swarming is a non-tiered philosophy of incident support, and it's seen some moderate uptake in recent years, but it's still not universal, but can help some organizations. More importantly, though, it really correlates with exceeding expectation for overall business results and can help that way. Blameless retrospectives are exactly as they sound. They're postmortems to understand the overall state of affairs rather than to assign accountability. But also incident management has evolved. So its overall state of affairs has also started to include things like chat ops. Whilst relatively new in this space, chat ops has rapidly proven itself as a key component of effective incident management, using pre-configured integrations provided by things like AI platforms. Chat ops has allowed teams large and small to improve their response capabilities at almost every step in the incident resolution process. So again, it's not something you want to throw away, it's something you want to adapt and improve. So if we accept that we're in a world that is in a state of flux, several of these traditional ITSM disciplines still have their place, even if they're evolved. What has changed dramatically that we have to look anew? Well, one of those key things really is automation. One of the biggest challenges we've seen over kind of the last 10 years has been the way infrastructure technology suppliers have succeeded in abstracting a much lower level of complexity away through package design. So, I'm sure Mark would talk about this in that, cloud services today are very different to sort of cloud services 10 years ago. It's become much simpler. And really, this has happened not a moment too soon, because end customers' expectations are really accelerating. So anything that isn't simplified via abstraction, it just can't keep up.
5 minutes, Duncan.
Thanks, Mark. And one of the key things that we abstracted and simplified really is cloud computing. Building on virtualization, public cloud services have fueled a wave of abstraction. Things like hybrid models are unifying public cloud with various on-prem technologies, and that is starting to set in as a sort of default model. Some examples. So GE back in 2015. Now, Mark obviously talked about one of their disasters, which was their digital services piece that they put together. But one of the good things they did was they moved back in 2015 to all their on-premises stuff away to cloud, apart from what they called their secret sauce. So the stuff they wanted to keep very, very close to, they kept in-house, but anything that they could put out to the cloud, they did. At the heart of this new model is an array of management software that really evolves quickly, and automation is a key way of making this all work together. So most automation really accelerates the execution of whatever you're doing. So if you apply automation to a good process, you produce excellent outcomes a lot faster. However, if you apply that same automation to a bad process, you really can cause disaster. To kind of paraphrase an old saying, to err is human, to really foul up it takes a computer. So how do you avoid some of these disasters? Well, one of the first things to do is really refine your processes first and then seek the tools to drive it. Your needs should drive your tools, not the other way around. Professionals have had this rule backwards for many years, and despite constant preaching by thought leaders, it still happens. Bring fresh thinking into your decision process and never to start the discussion with the tool. Start with the functions it has to perform, and then and only then so you start evaluating your options. Another key way of improving how you can apply automation is to find vendors that want to partner with you and then start to do things like tool integrations. So follow the lead of some infrastructure leaders who look at automation vendors who are investing in being partners with customers now instead of simply vendors. Why is that important? Because for the foreseeable future, you'll still need a number of tools and they won't integrate nearly as well as you want them to. So this integration is one of the reasons that infrastructure code requires infrastructure professionals to write that code. A vendor that will work with you and really wants to partner will be a massive bonus in that situation. But as you do that, you need to continue relentlessly tweak your governance we talked about earlier. So widely implemented automation tools have great power, but you also have to wield that power responsibly. Things like limiting command line access to very few people is important. Delegating access to the automated tools instead. Tailor those tools to ensure that guardrails are in place to prevent accidental misconfiguration, whether manual or mass produced. And you need to test, measure, and optimize that governance frequently. As I've mentioned, automation can be imperfect. So to protect your business, you also need to do other things. So adapt a modular, what we're seeing organizations do is to adapt a modular design for infrastructure services and automation. A major reason for fragility of many technology services is they often couple disparate systems too tightly. So that modular design really isolates failure. Because APIs and integrations are limited, the failure affects only a small component in that situation. So good microservice design will plan for failures within the domain of expected outcomes. Start to pair sense and adapt automation with advanced analytics to detect those failures quickly. It's certainly in our breakout group, we talked about the importance of spotting failures very quickly so you can do things about it and reduce risk. Most automation still involves some sort of human trigger, whether it's requesting cloud resources, for example, or to fail over to a disaster recovery instance. As automation evolves, sense and adapt automation become more and more prominent. And as that automation matures, using things like chatbots to combine human intellect with automated actions becomes much more important. Going back to change management, make changes in small, frequent increments. So traditional change and release gather large collections of changes together to implement in a fixed window. Borrowing from agile and DevOps, many organizations are making small changes frequently and don't wait for windows. Great organizations make several changes every day during their peak business hour. An example of this is at Etsy. Every new developer pushes code into production on their first day of the job. If something fails, the tools allow immediate restoration to the prior state. But it's a much better way of doing things. And lastly, really building feedback into your automation is important. So the last thing you want to do is fire off some improved automation and let's forget about it. You want to observe its actions and results. So use the feedback to improve the system and use analytics when it's relevant. And make the data available so that people who need to know about it can learn from it. Now, one of the things we sometimes get asked is, will this automation lead to a time where we don't really need any operations staff? And at Forrester, we think this is a no. The reason we think this won't happen is even though it starts automating, automation starts to reduce some of the work operations staff need to do, they'll actually become more closely aligned to developers. Whilst many people kind of wring their hands over the idea that operations may become automated in some way, we think that's a slight mistake. But even with fully automated service environments, someone still has to manage the resources, model the configurations, and optimize the infrastructure as code. Those ops professionals of the future will be much more technically skilled, but they'll focus on core attributes of reliability, redundancy, and resiliency. Mark, thanks for that. That really covers the kind of three things I wanted to look at, and some of the three key findings we found in that report. But it's, I think the synopsis is it's a changing world, but a lot of the things we do now just need to adapt and improve to really stay relevant.